Just so that everyone's aware, yeah. So we are recording for those who couldn't be with us today. So, Aisquaitchilsiam, bienvenue. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for this special Lansdowne lecture by Kelly Wright on institutionalized anti-Black linguistic racism. I'm Alexandra Darcy, Professor of Linguistics and Associate Dean Research for the Faculty of Humanities. And as we start things off this evening, I acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Husainich peoples, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. I'm on campus at the University of Victoria this evening, but many of you are joining from elsewhere. It's actually been wonderful to see all the different places that people are joining us from. So whether you're here in Victoria or somewhere else entirely, you know, whether in this place currently known as Canada or some other place, wherever you are, please feel free to paste your own land acknowledgement into the chat this evening. So as a sociolinguist, and especially as a specialist of English linguistics, I'm increasingly aware of the colonial nature of so much of our theorizing, where we frame understandings of the history of language around settler and predominantly Euro-American norms and realities. So for this reason, I'm particularly drawn to the subject of tonight's lecture, which promises to push us all to think a little harder about the ways we use language, the ways we think about language, and the ways language is operationalized simultaneously to the benefit of some and the explicit detriment of the others. And of course, my son is phoning me right now. It's the one ringtone that comes through when my phone is silenced. So a little bit of reality there in the middle of our Zoom. So Kelly Elizabeth Wright is a PhD candidate in the Department of Linguistics at the University of Michigan. She's an experimental sociolinguist specializing in linguistic discrimination and its institutional outcomes. An Afrolachian raised in Knoxville, Tennessee, she identifies as a working class Black biracial cisgender woman. Kelly is a scholar activist working for linguistic justice outside the academy and for interdisciplinarity inside the academy. As a public academic and former Mellon Fellow for Publicly Engaged Humanities, it may come as no surprise that Kelly has her own YouTube channel, where she engages openly and honestly about the intersection of language and society. And she's a frequent guest on language-oriented podcasts, including a discussion she recently had about white supremacy and the ways in which it's encoded in language. We'll put the direct link for that one in the chat now. Thank you, Lisa. In fact, all of Kelly's media can be accessed alongside heaps of other useful and thought-provoking revelatory material through her personal website. Currently, she's researching perceptions of professionalism. Her research also includes a machine learning study of lexical racialization in sports journalism and an acoustic study of linguistic profiling in the housing market. She's also an accomplished lexicographer. I've had the great pleasure of working with Kelly on the steering committee of the North American Research Network in Historical Sociolinguistics, where she's a tremendous colleague. She also serves on Language Matters, the University of Michigan Linguistic Diversity Initiative, the Linguistic Society of America social media. The host muted me. So she also serves on the University of Michigan Linguistic Diversity Initiative, the Linguistic Society of America Social Media Committee, the American Dialect Society New Words Committee, the Oxford English Dictionary Researchers Advisory Group, and as an editor's assistant for the flagship linguistics journal, Language. On top of all of these accomplishments, Kelly is also a classically trained coloratura soprano. And in her spare time, she collects vintage pencils and is a versatile chef. And so the Faculty of Humanities, alongside learning and teaching support and innovation, is deeply thrilled and completely honored to be hosting Kelly as a Lansdowne Scholar tonight, as she shines the light on the ways in which linguistic discrimination oppresses marginalized peoples. If you're on Twitter, our handle is going into the chat now, and we'll post Kelly's handle there too. Thank you all for being here with us and for being open to learning, even when, especially when the learning is uncomfortable. Just before I pass the mic to Kelly, I'll quickly mention that Anna Lee Lepp, Dean of Humanities, and Lisa Surridge, Associate Dean Academic for the faculty, are here and assisting us with this event tonight. We'll remind you again later, but if you have a question for Kelly, please feel free to post it in the chat. We'll be taking questions at the end of her presentation. And finally, following what has become standard Zoom protocol, please keep your microphone muted at all times unless you're asking a question and we've asked you to unmute. And so without further ado, Kelly, the Zoom room is yours.
Alex, thank you so much. Thank you all for having me here today. I am so excited to be with you. I am going to share my screen and get started. I truly couldn't be more excited to be here at the University of Victoria, visiting with you for this semester as a Lansdowne scholar. Here we go. Okay. So, institutionalized anti-Black linguistic discrimination. I like to begin my talks with positionality statements. And I do this because I believe that marking our positionality when we step into positions of power, like at the front of a lecture hall, is an essential first step that we can all take towards creating equity. And so I will reintroduce myself by saying, hello, I am Kelly Elizabeth Wright. I am a Black biracial cisgender woman from Appalachia. I am a fifth-year PhD candidate. I am working class. And I am a second generation student. And in that, I mean, my father was an integrator. He was the first African-American student to attend the Catholic school in my hometown. And thus I am one generation removed from educational segregation. I am so excited to be here at the University of Victoria with you all today. Having the space to speak about these issues is important when all around us here in the United States, the ability of educators to simply stand still and tell the truth is under attack. And so I have chosen quite purposefully this evening to enact my freedom to teach about the history of racism present at the founding of the United States and the lasting effects of that presence on the self-determination of people today. I'll be speaking for about 40 minutes, and I'll be giving you some background on linguistic discrimination from a perceptual perspective, and then I'll move into discussing terminology and relevant points of US history to set the stage for our consideration of several brief examples of institutionalized anti-Black linguistic discrimination. And at the end, I'll quickly outline my ongoing dissertation research for you before opening the floor to discuss what you are most interested in. In an effort to make this talk as accessible as possible, I've provided this bit.ly link here so that you can follow along with these slides, in which also include a full transcript in lieu of signed interpretation for this event. My work is on linguistic discrimination, which is a natural phenomenon that amplifies systemic oppression. So let's take those 2 points in turn. First, the natural phenomenon component begins with parsing the linguistic signal. In fact, all perception works this way. So our senses, smell, touch, taste, hearing, and sight, give us the ability to perceive the world around us, and our brains categorize or parse that information into discrete, meaningful elements. We are able to discriminate if something is dark or light, near or far, or if we are hearing a pa or a ba. This information is processed in real time, and it's stored in our minds based on all of our previous accumulated experience of the world. Language is never experienced in a vacuum. It comes into our brains along with all the information our senses are taking in the moment. And our brains are aware of this. What this means is that linguistic knowledge building is based on perception, and thus the meaning making process in our minds is a relativistic and egocentric one. And that creates some very important consequences downstream. It is this final and crucial aspect of perception that allows for the more insidious side of linguistic discrimination to operate. Because typically, we aren't just sensing language issuing from the world around us, it comes from another person, right? From a living source. And so, what that means is the signs we perceive aren't separable from the language users producing them or our orientation towards them. Remember, all knowledge categorized through our previous experience of the world. So, linguistic perception inherently engages the social experience. As human beings, the perceptual engines in our minds are designed to notice change in the environment. So, for example, when you come home from work, you don't notice if everything is as it should be. We only start to be concerned if something is out of place or if it moves in a way we didn't expect and that startles us. If everything is as it should be, if the patterns we've come to expect and have adapted to are in place and no flags are raised, we can just go on with our evening, right? Like walk the dogs, do whatever. Because linguistic perception is a sensory experience, this passive adaptation is inherent in our linguistic experience as well. And so we've adapted to the patterns around us. And the patterns around us most often are our own voices, right? Which is why it's so weird when you hear a recording of yourself, because we're not used to experiencing our own voice from outside our head. So what the patterns we're most used to are our own voices, our first language, the variety of our local communities. We're the center of our own story, relativistic and egocentric. But because people produce language with their bodies, and aspects of our bodies, like gender and age and race, are inextricable from our social roles, and the linguistic patterns we've passively adapted to are linked to certain sets of expectations that, for better or worse, stem from the historical construction of those social roles, those adaptations then become anything but passive and are what allow for natural linguistic discrimination to result in disadvantageous outcomes for many people, especially accented speakers and racially minoritized individuals. So, to now address the second part of what I study, the amplification of systemic oppression. A question I am often asked is, are we predisposed to be judgmental towards those who speak differently? And this is something I want us all thinking about while I present examples of institutionalized linguistic discrimination this evening. And so I'm taking the risk of putting a big question before you at the beginning. And the answer to this question is yes and no. So when we start to consider what types of language people deem to be proper or believe sound pleasing to the ear, or we've determined are more appropriate than other types of language for certain venues or forms of address, none of that falls out of the natural evolution of linguistic systems. Those realities are products of who has been in social control over time. And who has been in social control over time? Able-bodied, cisgendered, hearing and speaking men. And for most of written history, those men have also been Christian, white, and moneyed. So when we want to consider how the natural process of linguistic discrimination, like telling the difference between pa and ba, can be amplified by systemic oppression, that's how. Because the signs we perceive aren't separable from the bodies producing them and what we know about the social roles those bodies inhabit. The material and social history of the world has a significant influence over the functional operation of our individual linguistic systems. And there isn't a single person alive who isn't laboring to construct and conduct self under that influence. So, that's a lot. It's my hope by the end of this talk today that these points will have been fully illustrated for you, and we can have an open discussion on your thoughts about their implications. So, okay. I'm an experimental sociolinguist who engages in inquiry from a large-scale, top-down, historically informed stance. And I do this because what is most interesting to me about language change is how the social history of the world essentially selects for us a pool of language to interact with. The late Sam Epstein used to characterize this as the relationship of language and space-time. We exist as beings in linear time. We cannot go backward and interact with previous states of language. And we cannot make meaning as we would have done in previous states of society. Thus, we must go forward and construct self, like do self, with the lexical material that is currently in circulation, which is employed according to societal rules placed on a user. Are you tired of hearing me say that? Okay. So the Uniformitarian Principle, which linguists have borrowed from geology, states that while we cannot predict every variable that will matter for change at a given point in time, there are certain variables we can be confident will always have some effect. We've come to know these as the big five sociolinguistic variables: age, gender, socioeconomics, region, and race. All of these aspects of self relate to one's embodied positionality, in that we are born in a place, into a family of some station, we have race, we have gender, or at least our assigned gender at birth based on our visible secondary biological sexual characteristics, and we begin aging. These aspects of self are definable for all language users, and they constrain to some extent the subsection of extant linguistic material a given user can experience, can generate knowledge of the world with and through. So in a few moments, I'm going to give you several examples of such constraints, illustrating what it means to have your self-expression limited because of who you are. In 1705, the institution of slavery is officially codified in what would later become the United States. And although enslaved Africans had been laboring against their will on this continent since around 1501, the document written in 1705 was created for a specific purpose, and that was to shore up confusions created since 1619 in mercantile standards. Slavery was an industry, one that had all but supplanted the tradition of indentured servitude. Now, until this point, people of all colors and nationalities traded their labor for a certain period of time, usually between 4 and 7 years, to come to the New World. This document in 1705 creates two racial classes of people from what was once a homogeneous indentured servant class already present on the continent. The white indentured servants, upon completion of their contracts, are effectively given the means to begin generating wealth. 10 bushels, 30 shillings, and a gun if they were a man. Now, to translate this into something meaningful, 10 bushels is a lot. That's 600 pounds of grain. Now, 1 acre of wheat is enough to feed a family for 2 years. So that is more than enough, not only to keep a whole family alive, but also for them to start a business, for them to become self-sustaining, right? And 30 shillings is about 150 bucks, and that was enough to survive on for a year. Black people, on the other hand, are transferred immediately into enslavement, making their servitude contracts null and void. The 1705 document also outlines, as many mercantile contracts do with live cargo, how owners are allowed to punish those that step out of line, effectively dehumanizing the Black population and removing any immorality or possibility of punishment for the killing of Black people by those who now possess them. So when you hear people say that race is a construction, this is what they are referring to. The powers that be took a society where a social distinction by physical appearance did not exist and created the conditions to make it exist, further reinforcing them by reward on the one end and punishment and death on the other. All right, some terminology. I use the term African American languages, or AAL, to describe Black language, joining Lanehart in taking a top-down historical approach to categorization. I feel that what unites these language users is the shared social history of enslavement and settler colonialism. When Africans were packed onto ships bound for this continent, again, as cargo, they were separated by language, so they would be unable to communicate. Throughout this process, their connections to culture and identity were forcibly and purposefully erased. What is left over are disparate linguistic systems in the minds of survivors thrust into a created social relationship. Throughout the subsequent centuries, these survivors were under intense and intimate contact with English and other colonial languages. After the Civil War, these populations mobilized into the largest movement of peoples recorded on this continent, the Great Migration. This mobilization of self-determination and will results in a period of reanalysis and recombination for Black language. And while we do not want to consider all Black language users as a monolith, there are some important linguistic experiences that these populations share before this all-important post-migration recombination period. And the first relates to anti-literacy laws. The United States is the only country to have anti-literacy laws which restrict its own population. The 1739 Negro Act made it illegal to teach enslaved Blacks how to read. These laws were on the books in the North until 1834 and in the South until after Reconstruction, so around the 1860s. And they exist not just because of this idea that an educated slave is a dangerous person, but that literacy itself threatens the justification for enslavement, that Africans were less human, permanently illiterate, and dumb. And so were Black people able to have enriched linguistic experiences, to participate in knowledge creation, there wouldn't be this reason to dominate them. Black people, of course, were not citizens. As made clear through the 1705 codification of slavery, citizens are, in fact, fair complexioned peoples of European descent. The Constitution in the United States still says that, so it's true in the present. And the Supreme Court has a mechanism called naturalization by which individuals who do not fit that description might become citizens. Now, the court had a list of certain ways of appearing or behaving that could be used as metrics to determine if an individual could successfully assimilate into America and become a citizen. So let's consider the application of those metrics. First, in the case of Yup, a man from China who applied for citizenship in 1878. And I have linked here the actual case documents because I feel that reading them, like really being present for the verbal gymnastics the court goes through to rationalize these decisions, is an important exercise. Okay, so Mr. Yup claimed that he was fair-skinned enough to meet the definition of citizenship and thus should be allowed to become an American. But the arguments against him in front of the court stated that, quote, white person does not refer to color of skin, but instead an understanding in popular culture, in popular speech acquired in the literature or common parlance, end quote. And the Supreme Court agrees that indeed citizenship is equal to whiteness, but that whiteness is more about standard language use than it is about skin color, and Mr. Yup does not become a citizen. The next case I'd like to present is Ex parte Shahid in 1913. Mr. Shahid was a Syrian man who attempted to naturalize under the precedent set in 1909 by Mr. Najor, a light-skinned Syrian businessman who did become a citizen. The court decides to hear no arguments, using their metrics to rule immediately that Mr. Shahid is undesirable as a citizen by stating first that he is, quote, browner than a walnut, end quote, and second, that he is, quote, so accented he could be of no benefit to the United States, end quote. And finally, let us consider what is truly the saddest example of US versus Thind in 1923. Bhagat Singh Thind was an upstanding Hindu businessman and World War I veteran who attempted to naturalize after a minority opinion stating that the recent uptake of the term Caucasian might mean that Indic peoples could now count as white because of a shared ethnic heritage with Europeans. SCOTUS considers this and decides that the, quote, lesser peoples of Europe, the Germans, Irish, and the Poles, end quote, could count as white because they, quote, quickly merge and lose the distinct hallmarks of their heritage, whereas Hindus retain the marks of their ethnicity indefinitely, particularly in accent, end quote. What these anti-literacy laws and naturalization cases illustrate for us is that as the nation is solidifying itself, establishing institutions, language is playing a huge role in outlining the self-determination of various non-white populations in the United States. Black people can't even interact with the language in any material sense. People of other races aren't thought to be useful or capable because of their proximity to English, but it is crystal clear that these constraints have nothing to do with the language being produced or with accentedness placing genuine limits on ability. These arguments are about race, and they are made for a singular purpose, the preservation of a dominant white worldview. And to further illustrate this point, I would like to discuss the very different path white language is taking up, and away from Black language varieties. So during this period, white men and later white people are participating in a global project of codification. During the 18th and 19th centuries, white people named the heavens. They named every part of my body of color. They established units of measure, used them to split the world into a grid, find all the creatures in it, classify, title, and value them. People of color have been kept out of all official processes of meaning making for the entire history of print. And I mean that quite literally. These patterns of oppression predate the printing press. The point is, we know that linguistic material is employed according to societal rules placed on users, based on one's embodied positionality. Big five sociolinguistic factors. With people of color absent from the processes of knowledge creation, we begin to glimpse the insidiousness of the groundwork being laid here. Because with white people in control of all the linguistic material, they then have complete control of all societal function as well. This is a full-scale process of standardization. And I highlight that ization suffix here so we can be sure to recognize that there is a making and a doing going on here. There is an agentiveness to these processes. The standard is not a natural language variety. It does not evolve. It is not acquired. It represents the preferred linguistic repertoire of the powerful that must be learned. And so here we have Noah Webster of Webster's Dictionary, who can be thought of as a founding father for the role he played in distinguishing American English from British varieties. His was a meticulous and tedious lexicographic project that is not without merit, but Webster was a fucking racist who was also fancied himself a historian. Despite everything he wrote being utter nonsense, like that all Hindus were cowardly and effeminate, or that God first created blacks, saw he made a mistake, and then kept making man lighter and lighter until he got it right. Webster's History of the United States was basically the fire bestseller of the era, and it ended up being used as a textbook in school districts all across the United States, sometimes up until the 1940s. Yeah. Webster represents just one of these white people, these citizens who are afforded access to written language, who are afforded equal protection under the law, and who have these types of beliefs about people who are not white, and who are doing all of this work of naming and defining what it means to be a good person, who are defining appropriateness, success, innocence, sincerity, and on and on. In the United States, white language becomes the standard, following waves of xenophobia away from the immigrant-rich population centers of New York and Philadelphia to settle in the inland North dialect region. And the use of this variety is seen as the proper thing to do. More than this, not using this variety is seen as an indicator of lower intelligence or sometimes a difficult or even criminal nature. And because white standardized spoken English enjoys institutional support, it is used in all formal, creative, and technical writing in courts and across professions. Assimilation is required for social mobility. And with assimilation in mind, I want to turn back to Black people. Black life and language is not thought of as capable or complete or even passing assimilation into American ways of life, and has therefore been purposefully separated from literacy, again, by law, and thwarted in education, further reinforcing the distinction of Black people as second-class citizens. Because of identity, because of race, there are only so many parts of the language that Black people have been allowed to interact with for centuries. This history and treatment of Black people sets their language apart. And I want to focus now on the differential treatment of Black language varieties in education. In 1971, the Lau v. Nichols decision creates a federal mandate for English language learning education. At this point in time, we'd seen a few other cases create such programs at the district level. But now, if a district has a certain percentage of so-called foreign language speakers, it must provide English language learning education to overcome language barriers that impede equal participation. In both of these cases, Ann Arbor and Oakland, Black students were being segregated placed into special ed classes and labeled as neuroatypical because of their first language. These cases represent two different and ultimately unsuccessful legal approaches taken in an attempt to gain equal participation for Black students in the classroom. In Ann Arbor, litigators sought to extend the Lau v. Nichols ruling to dialects, but courts were not convinced of the equality of dialects to languages, categorizing them as broken or incompletely acquired versions of the standard. In Oakland, linguists testified before Congress that Ebonics should be considered a language in its own right. But again, the powers that be are not convinced that Black language should be federally protected. In both Ann Arbor and Oakland, stopgap solutions were put in place at the district level. But even these misguided and inequitable approaches weren't nationally adopted. And so US dialect speakers still do not enjoy equal educational opportunities like English language learners do. Black linguistic experiences in the education system are categorically different from those of other learners who also do not have access to white standardized spoken English. Considering these two cases illustrates the reticence of administrators to recognize the validity of Black language and to afford Black people with the same equal participation awarded to all English language learners since 1971. This treatment of Black language in schools has an outsized impact on how Black people are later treated in the world. Through the processes of education and socialization, we see Black language users being marked as less than. And this gives institutions permission to treat them this way as well. Sounding Black in adulthood then becomes a marker of all these negative connotations like low intelligence and laziness, because the education system should have fixed them. And thus the failure lies with the individual. This deficit model is baked in to the way America does business. I suspect most of us are familiar with the well-discussed stereotyped images of the Jim Crows in Dumbo or the headless Mammy Two Shoes in Tom and Jerry. The ways in which Black language has been used in mediated portrayals of characters across animated media since the genre was created contributes to supporting in non-Black and Black populations the ideological groundwork laid by an education system whose goal is the perpetuation of American institutions and ideas. Cartoon watching children for generations never saw or heard Black language issuing from a character portraying an educated person, or sometimes even a person at all. As Heaton 2018 reports, it took Disney until 2009 to put African American language into a human being, let alone a main character, Princess Tiana. AAL speech in Disney was previously relegated to animals and mythical creatures, most of whom are either villainous or exhibit the most outrageous buffoonery. We talk about the school to prison pipeline, about how the ways in which Black students are punished in schools for their non-normative hair or dress or behavior, and how that creates situations of stereotype threat. About how young people begin to believe themselves to possess a criminal nature and find a life of crime to be their only alternative. But what we do not discuss often enough is how historical mediated characterizations of Blackness as something belonging to individuals who do not deserve respect, admiration, or compassion, as something belonging to individuals who are often engaged in nefarious purposes, reflects and reifies criminality stereotypes across generations and translates into real world consequences for Black people. The myth of unbeatable Black athleticism is a folk ideology that has been mistakenly applied throughout history. Folk ideologies are beliefs that we carry which influence our rational orderings of the world. This ideology, which is again not true, states that Black people are naturally suited for physical activity due to their primitive aggression and physicality, and are thus prone to violent displays, which makes them good at sports. And this ideology shapes the expectations of those interacting with Black people and has consequences in institutions outside of athletics. In the institution of healthcare, we know that Black patients who report pain are 22% less likely to receive medication. And I attribute this phenomenon in part to violated expectations of semantic intensity. Most of us are likely familiar with semantic intensity as a cousin of hyperbole. We increase intensity all the time when we describe something because of how we feel about it. Like when we say that share is ageless or that pizza is sacred. But in this case, folk ideologies about Black physicality affect semantic intensity from the other direction, creating an expectation of elevated descriptions of pain. So Black people arrive in an emergency room saying like, ow, ow, I'm hurting. But healthcare workers expect us to be like hulking out if we're experiencing something serious. Violated expectations of semantic intensity contribute to maintaining this very high mortality rate, especially for Black women in healthcare, something that was experienced by Serena Williams, who despite having excellent healthcare and a documented history of blood clots, was not believed when she reported chest pain that was later diagnosed as a pulmonary embolism when she flatlined after delivering her daughter Olympia. So part of Black linguistic experiences then is not being believed or taken seriously when reporting facts or events because of certain expectations about how we should be using language because of who we are. And sometimes when those expectations are violated, lives are lost. The practice of law is a fundamentally linguistic endeavor that is based on the one hand on the interpretation of precedent codified in written language, and on the other hand on the interpretation of the language produced by those involved in legal proceedings. In courts and in interactions with authorities, misunderstandings of African American language, words, and phrasing interact with deficit models and race-based stereotypes of innate physicality and violence to create life-threatening outcomes. During his encounter with police, George Floyd was thought to have uttered, "I ate too many drugs." But we know that this utterance was instead a perfectly legal AAL construction professing his sobriety. Thankfully, this misunderstanding did not allow his murderer to go free. But this is not the case with Trayvon Martin's killer, George Zimmerman, whose acquittal hung on the finding that Trayvon Martin was in fact the one who made it racial by calling Zimmerman a creepy ass cracker while being followed by him. Zimmerman's actions were determined not to be a hate crime because of the interpretation of this utterance. And Sandra Bland, whose arresting officer's perception of her speech as copying an attitude led her to being removed from her vehicle only to die later in police custody. So, even in these brief examples of institutionalized anti-Black linguistic discrimination, we've learned that Black people are not protected in the education system and are kept from participating in knowledge creation, are portrayed differently in ways that maintain stereotypes, and are consistently and even fatally misunderstood. My current dissertation research, which I'm going to preview for you now, is geared towards understanding the why of these happenings. What perceptual mechanisms help sustain these various linguistic oppressions? And I'm considering this question by researching Black professionalism, because there are two concepts which unite the experiences of most US Black professionals, and that is that they report being under pressure, if not requirement, to assimilate to white standardized spoken English, and that for most of us in our fields, equity is still a goal. It is not a reality. Misassimilation is not, however, the simple style shifting done to meet conversational ends, as Bell's audience design model would describe it. It is a necessity engaged with so that audiences do not reject the identity of a Black language user in a given social role, namely that of a competent professional. And so I've designed a new type of sociolinguistic interview seeking to capture metalinguistic awareness, or one's opinions, ideas, and knowledge about language use and distribution, in an effort to better understand how these social realities shape agentive constructions of identity by taking into account the new theoretical concept of sociolinguistic labor coming from Holiday and Squire's 2020, which is defined as the physical, emotional, and psychological effort put into deploying sociolinguistic resources in a way that is meant to satisfy others. Building on insights from these interviews, I have designed a perceptual experiment that presents listeners with pairs of sentences featuring variants that the Black professionals I interviewed have identified as aspects of their speech, which they are either aware of monitoring when they shift into more professional styles, or they report it as being characteristic of Black speech or Detroit speech. This task asks listeners to choose which sentence sounds most professional, and pilot results demonstrate that when non-standard features are present, the overwhelming majority of listeners will not label that sentence as professional sounding. Previous experimentation cited here indicates that listeners, when presented with a voice that possesses some type of stigmatized identity characteristic or speech feature, may block the rest of the speech signal after hearing that feature and base their judgments off their ideological assessments of that characteristic or feature, like not the rest of what they're hearing or being asked to do. So in these studies, blocking is raised in discussion as a possible explanation for patterns that have been observed in the results. But I've designed this paired sentence comparison experiment to test for blocking directly using acts as a highly salient, widely distributed, Black indexed, and deeply stereotyped variable to induce a blocking effect. My design also includes extended demographics and stereotype endorsement measures to help us better describe and analyze the intersectional identities of listeners and their positionality effects. I hypothesize that this experiment will provide evidence about the influence of standard language ideologies on speech judgments and help us better and more objectively define for the Black professional community what legible performances of their professionalism are. I brought some pilot results to show you, but in the interest of time, I think it's best we stop here to leave plenty of time for your questions. Thank you ever so for inviting me to be here with you and to think about these issues together. I've left my contact information here for you so that you can follow up with me this semester while I'm here visiting, and I do hope that many of you will do so. I will leave this up here for a moment while I take a sip of water before I stop sharing my screen and we transition. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kelly, for that powerful, provocative, and critical presentation. I have some favorite quotes, but I might save them for a little bit later. We're gonna open things up to the audience now. We have approximately 25 minutes for questions. And so we're going to ask that you keep your questions short and concise, as well as respectful and focused on Kelly's presentation. But just as you reflect on her talk and start to put your questions into the chat, we have a surprise for you. And that's a door prize. So from February 7th to 11th, we're hosting Humanities Week, a week-long series of events designed to showcase the strength and creativity of humanities research here at UVic. And our door prize tonight is a copy of Colleen Hele Cardinal's book, published by Fernwood Publishing, a 60s scoop adoptee story of coming home. So Colleen will be giving a reading from this book at the final event of Humanities Week on February 11th, where she will also engage in a conversation with Dean Annalie Lepp and answer audience questions. So Lisa, who is tonight's lucky winner of this fabulous, difficult and important book?
So I have a very exciting wheel that I'm going to spin, and I'm going to say that we've entered everyone who registered, and more people registered than actually showed up. So I may call out a name of someone who's not yet here, but we're going to go until we get a winner. So the wheel is spinning right now. So I have our first name just stopping. And our first winner, and I do believe he is here, is Aaron DeVore.
Ah!
That's crazy. Hi.
Aaron, congratulations. And I'm hoping you're going to be moved by this very serious and engaging book.
Well, thank you so much. I'm thrilled that I got chosen, and thank you so much for the talk as well.
Great. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Aaron. We'll make sure that this gets to you.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, so we're gonna move into questions, and I see that they are starting to come up here in the chat for us. Ruby asks you, in your opinion, how do you think anti-Black linguistic racism, linguistic discrimination plays out in higher education?
I mean, what a big question. I mean, essentially, linguistic discrimination happens kind of every time we use language. So, you know, if you're speaking, writing, or signing, it's at play. And again, like, it starts out as a natural phenomenon, right? So we're discriminating between things. Really, we're just trying to notice the difference between stuff. So if there's systemic oppression that's present, you know, noticing the difference between things, laying on top of systemic oppression. So is systemic oppression present in higher education? Absolutely. Right? So linguistic discrimination is basically just sitting on top of the oppression, the systemic imbalances that already exist. So one way that, you know, linguistic discrimination kind of operates is it lets us sort of stand in for other isms, right? So, you know, we're not allowed to be like openly racist or openly sexist or openly ageist. But we are allowed to say things like, I hate this paper, or your work isn't appropriate, or I'm going to give you a D, you know, or, you know, I don't like these ideas that you have here. We are allowed to use the way that people craft their writing or speak in front of an audience to dismiss them because of who they are, you know, or not meaningfully engage with their ideas and put it on their language use and say that it's not appropriate, or say that they are not the right person to deliver a message. That happens all the time in higher education to people who work and learn there.
Thanks for that, Kelly. Ruby, did you want to follow up, or was that, you want to follow up?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Would you like to? So Kelly, Ruby is a PhD student here in the Department of Linguistics, and her co-supervisor is Sonja Lanehart, whose fabulous book you showed during part of your presentation. So Ruby, I'll let you follow up.
Yeah. So for instance, if you write like a research, I know I've forgotten her name, but she's at Stanford right now. Her research, you know, research on how, minorities research is taken for granted, right? So maybe that is another way where discrimination comes to play, right? Like, oh, your research is not good enough, the way your methodology is not good enough and stuff like that. But I have one other question, you know, taking into consideration history. the history of US is definitely different from the history take for instance, UK. Okay, so have you considered how linguistic discrimination would manifest in a context like UK? Because the history is different. How minority, like minorities in UK, how they experience discrimination is a little bit different from how the US, minority, I don't want to say minority, minoritized in the US is different. So have you considered that, how the differences are, or how the linguistic discrimination plays out in a context like UK or even Canada?
Yeah, thank you for this question. This is great. So my specific research, I haven't delved personally as deeply into the, nuts and bolts, bullet points of history in other countries as I have here. But my first research in linguistics was looking at nationalism in Ghana. So I started, so this is not the UK, but it is, people who wrested their freedom from, from the British, right? And I looked at basically like, how do you create nation? How do you create an Africa for Africans? This is like how I became a linguist, right? It was like, how do you create Africa for Africans in English? Like, how does this happen in the language of the colonizer? Like, it broke my mind, right? And then I came out asking that question, like on the other side of that, I was a linguist, right? So I think that as the phenomena, right, that kind of make this happen, that like the systemic oppression, right, like the facts of it, like the individual points of history, like these cases that I talked about, and the 1705 codification of slavery, like that document is different in the UK, it's different in India, it's different in Canada, but they exist, right? These moments in time where we pulled people apart and we said they're different, they look different, and they're different. And even if there's not a document, right? In the paper, it's and these slides that I share with you all, part of the reason why I share them is because they're chock full of links, right? The annual review of linguistics paper that myself and my co-authors wrote, we talk about any society that has a standard language variety is not immune to linguistic discrimination, right? And so, I mean, you don't even need text. You don't even need people that are different colors. You don't even need any of that, right? We can talk about like matrilineal, oral, 100%, like people who have never come in contact with technology, right? Like linguistic discrimination is still present there. If you have a hierarchical social structure, it's happening, right? Because there's if you've created a hierarchical society, the conditions exist for this. It doesn't necessarily mean that they have arisen, but the conditions exist. So yeah, it's just something to pay attention to. It's just something to pay attention to. It's like those facts of history are different kind of wherever you necessarily are, but it's kind of just plugging them in and trying to figure out where it happened, and how it's different. And so it's kind of asking yourself, which population is the most at risk now? Who is hurting the most at this point?
Thanks, Kelly. The questions are coming fast and furious now. So we've got 4.
I'll try and make my responses shorter.
It's okay. It's such an important conversation. That's the challenge, right? All these great questions, and yet time, where you started your whole presentation. But let's go to the next one. So Jennifer, you have your hand up there. So I don't know what your question is, but maybe I'll ask you to ask.
Sure, thank you. It's a two-part question because I want to make sure that I'm on the right track, confirm or be corrected before I have the second part of my question. The first part is I want to confirm my understanding that you're saying that African American language features is what might be called a marked form for a white listener that triggers a negative reaction. Do I have that correct in what you were saying in your presentation?
Are you asking about the dissertation or just in general?
What you've been lecturing on and your findings thus far?
Not necessarily, no.
Okay. When you were talking about the professionalism and the switch and the sociolinguistic labor that was required, then would you mind correcting my understanding then, please?
I'm not, I don't know that I would ever, I don't know how you're using the term marked. Sociolinguistic labor is something that every single human engages in.
Yes.
So we're all doing
the idea that something that stands out because it's different from what a white listener might be expecting. It's not the codified, rarefied form, and therefore there's something of a reaction.
I don't know that it's necessarily a white listener. So that's actually part of what I'm specifically investigating, but Black people expect the standard too. We all expect it. Because so in the beginning, when I was saying like, there's not a single person alive who isn't affected by the material and social history of the world. These patterns of oppression predate the printing press. We're all affected by it, all of us, because this stuff is as old as text. Right. So it's not, this stuff is wider than anything that you want to say about a social group, and so Black people think the standard is where they want to go too. They want to assimilate. I feel it's weird for me to say I'm speaking for a whole group of people. So let me say that the 17 Black professionals that I interviewed for my dissertation have reported similar feelings. Right. So that's obviously not the whole Black world, right? That they feel a need to assimilate in this way. And we've seen evidence of this for a long time, right? Like, so the parts of the reason, one of the reasons why the Oakland Ebonics case failed, why Congress didn't buy the argument that Ebonics should be a language in its own right, is because there was not agreement in the Black community that Ebonics was a language, because Black people said, I don't speak a language that's different than English. I speak English, right? I speak English. And it's not different, and it's not broken, and it's not blah, blah, blah. It's not something else, right? And then there were other people who are like, this is my language, it's different, it has a different history, it's different, right? And so Congress was like, y'all don't even know what you speak, we're not giving you a law. We're not protecting something if you don't know what it is, right? And so, yeah, so there's a lot going on.
Absolutely. And so is there part of it is the separating the untangling or uncoupling the idea of different and broken, and that there is difference, but it isn't wrong that there is difference, and accepting it.
Yeah. So that's, yep. And that's like, yeah, that's very much part of what I am trying to do, and trying to work for and towards, and I was trying to kind of understand the mentality. Like, it's that of like standard language ideologies for me are exactly this, of like the Black community has taken them up and they feel bad about their language variety, and I want them to understand where it comes from, to have pride in it. Right. And so I'm trying to understand how they're maintained, how they're taken up, so I can break them. But it's for all of us, right? I mean, it's not just for Black people, but I want, like, in interviewing, I'm talking too much, but in interviewing some of these people, it was like just asking them questions about like, hey, what does this word mean? Or, hey, tell me about this. And they'd say stuff like, oh, this isn't wrong, or this isn't blah. And I'm like, none of this is wrong. None of this is blah. Right. So it's very deeply rooted. Not just the white listener. All right. It's all of us.
Kelly, we've got one question that's up in the chat, and it's from Claire, and she says, thanks, Kelly. With respect to your experiment, do you anticipate that non-Black participants who already have extensive exposure to common features of African American languages will react differently to the prompts?
I hope so. We'll see. I mean, so that's part of why I'm asking like all these demographic questions and like doing a bunch of other stuff, is because I'm very, very interested in how different people do the task differently. That said, the pilot results are really striking. It kind of looks like everyone's doing the task in the same way. So yeah, we'll see. The experiment itself is going to be much more extensive than the pilot. We're testing a bunch of different conditions. And so yeah, I would love to see people doing this task very differently because of who they are and their exposure to African American language and the community and their positionality as individuals. I would say my like theoretical brain would say, yes, they will definitely do this differently. But given the results and some of the things I've seen, I actually think that these ideologies are very strongly embedded. And so if professionalism wasn't the question I was asking, I anticipate that this task would be done very differently.
Yeah, that's so interesting. There are heaps of thanks and nice compliments for you, so I will direct you to the chat maybe when we're done. There's time for, I think, one last question, and then we'll probably have to move along. So Tamara, you've had your hand up for a while now, so maybe we'll give you the honor of the final quick question for Kelly tonight.
Hi, thank you for giving the talk tonight. And is it my understanding you're actually on UVic's campus for this term? No? Okay, well, I'll just have to send an email. My question is in keeping with the fact that you're doing a PhD and dealing with these topics, how often do you find yourself perhaps coming to a head with the idea that in exploring and not rationalizing, because it doesn't need to be rationalized, but engaging with the idea that language outside of standardized professional English still qualifies as professional English when you're writing papers, putting together talks, submitting for publishing, and then having to look at that editing section and go, my paper talking about why this language is an appropriate language is not suitable for the paper I'm writing about this language being an appropriate language. Like where would you like to see that shift happen? Or how often do you just want to say, you know what, just take the paper, just take it, deal with the paper?
Yep. Yeah, a lot. It's a lot. And yeah, and it's a lot of that. I get this question a lot. I'm glad you asked it. People also ask me like, see, I didn't talk about my housing research today, but my housing research deals with my different dialects that I speak, and people often ask like, why aren't you giving this talk at a different voice? Things like that. It is very challenging. I think that I haven't figured out yet how I'm going to deal with that in like my personal professional existence outside of the PhD. It's something that I have tried to push back on the best I can in the ways that I can that are safe for me, because I am still at risk in these institutions as a junior person of color here. And it's that simple. And that's unfortunate. And yeah, and it's more than just the language, it's the topic. I still get a lot of resistance from the topic, and even centering Black voices in the dissertation has been an uphill battle, one that I haven't been completely successful in. And so, yeah, it's a challenge, and I do hope that that I have done at least a little work, needle moving for folks who come behind me, which is not the best answer. I'm a little deflated by it, as you can tell.
Oh, no, I mean, I know for me with the studying that I'm doing right now, it's towards the goal of publishing non-academic academic papers in that realm. People who want to write for a readership outside of academia and not have to be restricted by the same bounds, while still meeting the standard, but not constructing a notion of language that doesn't make sense to anyone not grading it. Yeah.
And I do my best to make my, classroom the safest space possible for folks and give them the most flexibility I can within the institution I'm placed in. I mean, it's create a safer space for the people behind you. Yeah.
No, it's not an easy question to answer. So thank you for engaging with it at all.
Of course. Thank you all.
So thank you so much, Kelly. I'd like to extend heartfelt thanks, genuine heartfelt thanks to you for your honesty and vulnerability, as much as for the insights that you brought to use. And I also want to thank all of our audience members for engaging with such open hearts and minds this evening. And we hope that this talk has provoked your own critical inquiry into your beliefs about language and your uses of language, both your own and those of others. And we're happy to have hosted you, and we hope to see you again soon, maybe even at Humanities Week. So Kelly, thank you, and good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kelly.
Oh, and I wrote in the chat if it's possible to email you personally. Is it okay?
Please.
I don't have your email address though.
Oh, okay. Did you get the link for the slides? It's on there.
Is it on there?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Isabel, if you send me an email, I can connect you.
Yeah, I have the slides, but is it at the end? Oh yeah, I have it. Okay, I should be able to copy. Okay, I'll send you a message. I'll tell you what I want to talk about.
Please do.
Okay, thank you. It was very nice, very great. Thank you so much.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, Kelly.